And so wanted to tell you a little bit about Scientists and Synagogues and then introduce our speaker tonight. Tonight would not be possible without the support of our friends at Sinai and Synapses, especially founding director and my rabbinical school colleague and classmate, Rabbi Jeff Middleman. Sinai and Synapses works to bridge the religious and scientific worlds, offering people a worldview that is scientifically grounded and spiritually uplifting. Our Scientists in Synagogues grant through Sinai and Synapses, and in partnership with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, and the John Templeton Foundation, has enabled us to bring wonderfully rich programming in the area of science and religion to Temple Isaiah. And we continue tonight with a beautiful program with Dr. David DeSteno. Dr. David DeSteno is a professor of psychology at Northeastern University, where he directs the Social Emotions Group. His research examines the mechanisms of the mind that shape vice and virtue. His work continuously reveals that human moral behavior is much more variable than most would predict. Dr. DeSteno's research interests include whether emotions can foster virtue, if compassion can be cultivated, and what behavioral science can learn from religion. Tonight, our conversation will focus around Dr. DeSteno's newest book, How God Works: The Science Behind the Benefits of Religion. He is the author of numerous other books and a regular contributor in print and TV media. We are so grateful to be able to join together tonight to welcome Dr. David DeSteno to the Temple Isaiah community. Welcome, Dr. DeSteno. Nice to see you.
Hi, thank you for having me. Happy to join you.
So glad you're here. We've got quite the group. It's so nice to see everyone. I wanted to start with sort of an opening question, which is, how did you, a scientist, come to write a book about spiritual practices?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, there's always been a little bit of a tension between religion and science, and these days it's kind of at a fever pitch with, there's hardcore fundamentalist sides of religion that believe science has nothing to offer. There are hardcore new atheist movements, people like Richard Dawkins, Steve Pinker, et cetera, who believe that religion is all superstition. I came to this from the outside. As you said, I study, emotion and virtue and social behavior. But what I found time and time again in my lab and in the research that I looked at is that the people who engage in a spiritual life, engage in spiritual practices, live longer, healthier, and happier lives. Now, saying you believe in God or you don't doesn't predict anything, but engaging in religious community, engaging in different types of spiritual practices, prayer, meditation, whatever they may be, the data are kind of incontrovertible. They are as healthy for you. They reduce morbidity to the same extent as stopping smoking does. They increase cardiovascular health. They reduce depression and anxiety. They even, ward off deaths of despair, which in these days of COVID and opioid addiction are rising. And so when I look at that data as a scientist, it tells me there is something going on. And it's kind of like a dose response model. The more you are engaged, the more protective you are. And so I began looking at practices. And I want to be, clear up front. There is no scientific test for the fingerprints of God. I can't tell you if God exists. No scientist can. Even Richard Dawkins, who's the foremost new atheist of our time, will say he can't prove whether or not God exists. And so I think that's a question that gets in the way. And so I urge people to put their isms to the side, whether it's Judaism, Catholicism, Buddhism, atheism, and let's look at these practices. And you can believe they were given by a God, he, she, or it, who cares about their people and wants to help them. And so these practices were given and divinely inspired. Or you can think they resulted from people trying stuff out over millennia and kind of debugging things, rituals to help people. But what you can argue about is that they do something. And so for me, one of our first forays into this was studying meditation. For a long time, there's been neuroscientists studying meditation, and we see that it increases your memory and changes your white matter. But that's not why it was created. It was created to reduce suffering and to enhance compassion. And so we ran some studies, which I'm happy to talk about in detail later if you want, where we actually showed that getting people, having them meditate for as little as 8 weeks, and then putting them in situations that we set up where other people needed help, other people, were in situations where compassion was necessary, we actually tripled the rate at which they would go and help them. And to me, that said something, right? It says that these practices have power. And this book, and my podcast too, which is also called How God Works on the PRX Network, is an attempt to bring scientists and religious leaders together to look at the science behind these practices and the way these rituals work. And I think if we don't do that, we are slowing the progress of the science of well-being. It's kind of hubristic for scientists to believe that thousands of years of thought aimed at helping people has nothing to offer. Does that mean that every ritual does something? No. Does that mean that religion always does good things? No. I think it is a set of tools and practices. Just like science, Richard Dawkins has said, if you want to find the most efficient way to kill the most people possible, science is your friend. If you want to find a way to help cure COVID, science is your friend. I think if we look at religion as practices, as technologies that shape and move the mind, there's a lot to learn there for scientists.
Thank you so much. I had a chance to listen to you speak a little bit about that study of people and helping other people. So I'd love to maybe in a little bit share a little bit more about your actual research. I think that would be great. Wanted to sort of push that just a little bit more, which is there's this tension or this perceived tension between religion and science. And how do you think, we talked about in our last program, people sort of tend to the religious camp or the science camp and sort of really struggle to place these two things together in some meaningful way. I'm wondering how you would respond or think about ways that we can find for religion and science to work together.
Yeah, I think the first step, as I said before, is to not argue about what is unknowable, right? I think, once we start putting isms on us, just like liberalism or conservatism, people get in their groups and they start yelling at each other.
You want to stay muted, and if you.
I think what we want to really basically do is think about the way religious practices work, not theology. Right? Scientists can't debate theology, and theologians can't always, say science is wrong when the proof is in front of us. But I think where the action is to try and understand how the brilliance of certain spiritual practices can be used to make life better. And, you can think about, people like Francis Collins are a wonderful example, right? The ex-director of the National Institute of Health, just retired, who's an evangelical Christian. That doesn't mean that he rejects evolution. He's a hardcore scientist, but he believes that, no one knows how we got here and there may be a divine hand in it, but that doesn't mean that he rejects science. I'm a scientist, and I'm humble enough to say, I don't know if there is a God, but what I know is that there's some benefit in exploring what religion has to offer people. And so I think if we're willing to in good faith have that conversation, that's useful. If we start talking about, stuff that's theologically derived, there is no way to prove whether God is behind a miracle or it's a chance act.
Absolutely. And I love that platform for us tonight. And I think maybe we'll talk about some of those practices and rituals, maybe in the order of the path of life. I know that's sort of how you constructed your book. So I'd love for you to lead us through some of your thinking and, anything, any of those things that you could elucidate for us along the path, both Jewish and other religious faith traditions, rituals as well.
Yeah. So, I always, just for an example, I always like to start at the end and work backward, although the book starts at first going forward. And the reason I say that is so let me start there, right? Grief and loss is something that everybody has to deal with in life, no matter who you are. It's unfortunate. And the trick with grief is to figure out, not to deny it, that's a problem, but how do I move through it without letting it become too intense or going on too long, both of which can be very paralyzing to people. And I think any departed loved one would not want that for the people that they leave behind. And so if you look at religious rituals across the spectrum, it's interesting to see how they work. And let me give you an example. One thing that almost all religions do is we eulogize the person who has passed, which seems kind of normal because we all do it. But if you think about it, it's kind of strange. If I just lost a job that I really love, or if my wife who I love just left me, I wouldn't want to think about how wonderful she was or how wonderful that job was, because it would make the pain all the more. But there's a lot of research coming out of many scientific labs that show it's people who can create a positive memory of a person who has gone that ruminate less, that have less depression, etc. And so part of all these rituals, what they do is they help us to create that positive memory. If you look at Shiva, which I know here being a synagogue, many of you are familiar with, it is a brilliant packaging of tools. So let me unpack it for you from the scientific side. So, one thing is it is a mitzvot, right? It is a sacred obligation that when a family is celebrating Shiva, you must go to the bereaved, bring them food, help them out, visit. It's not like, yeah, if I want to go, I'll go. You have to go. And that provides something that's called instrumental support. It's not social support like friends how many friends do you have on Facebook, right? These are people who show up and help you when you need them. One of the biggest predictors to reducing grief and moving through it in a resilient fashion is having people provide instrumental support to you, bringing you food, helping you with what you need, being there. When you form a minyan to say prayers, oftentimes you'll say the Mourner's Kaddish and other things in groups of at least 10 or more. And people are doing that in unison, right? When you do things in unison, it creates a sense of bonding. It creates a sense of compassion. So let me just give you an example of like an experiment we'll run. We'll bring people into my lab and they've never met before, and we'll have them put on earphones. They can't talk to one another, and they'll hear tones in the earphones. And what they have to do is in front of them, tap a sensor on the table to the tones. And we rig the tones. So either they're in time, so the people are moving in time, or they're random, and so they're not moving in time. After that, we ask them, how close do you feel to the other person? Mind you, it's someone they never met, someone that they have never seen, or they didn't talk to them even now. That simple act of moving in time makes people feel, they'll report being closer to one another. And when we rig a little situation where one of them needs help doing something, the other person will feel more compassion for that person if they had tapped in time than if they didn't. And by triple the rate, we'll offer to help them out with that little problem that we give them. And so when you're in services, be it Catholic Mass or be it saying minyan prayers during Shiva, that simple act is creating greater senses of compassion and empathy. You cover mirrors, right? Now, I know there's a theological reason for that, and Rabbi Amy could tell us what that was. But there's scientific research showing that whatever emotion you feel when you look into a mirror, it intensifies it. If you're feeling happy and you look in a mirror, it makes you happier. If you're feeling sad, look in a mirror and make you sadder. And so during Shiva or at Irish wakes or Hindu ceremonies, people cover mirrors. Why? Because it's a simple way to reduce grief a little. You sit low on the ground, on low stools, right, or on the ground. And you'll know that after a while, that's kind of uncomfortable. Can cause a little pain. You get up, it relieves that pain. There's new neuroscience research that shows mild onsets and offsets of discomfort in your muscles reduces grief and reduces rumination. And so there are all of these things packaged together that through the ages have been put together without understanding the science of why they work, right? People from millennia didn't have, they couldn't scan your brains, but they figured out that they work. And all of these things create ways to help us deal with the challenges of life, grief being one of them. I'm happy to talk about other ones too.
I'd love to hear about a few more of them, but before you go on, just a question, one that came up for me as I was doing some research and getting ready, this idea of ritual and doing things in unison. I'm wondering, and what it brought to my mind is there must have been, or maybe I'm projecting, a disruption of that experience due to COVID and not being able to gather together. Yeah. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on the impact of that, but also how it translated to an online community and maybe not that impactful.
Yeah, I mean, I think, rabbis, ministers, priests, whatever, they were all trying to figure out when services were closed down, how do we move this online? And I think the problem with that, and I mean, having it online is better than not having it all. Having some connection is better than not. But all of these rituals and practices were created to work when we're co-present and in communion with one another. When you get people into a room and they're talking to one another, their respirations synchronize, their heart rate synchronized. They feel that sense of closeness due to the synchrony. That stuff doesn't work as easily over Zoom. Think about even sitting shiva, right? Sitting shiva over Zoom, your face is front and center. And so what you're basically doing is defeating the benefits of that mirror, seeing your own face for the mourners and seeing the pain on it. I mean, we didn't have any alternative, but the question is, I think, going forward, and I've had rabbis and priests ask me, so what can science tell us about the better ways to do this when we have to move remotely? And I have no answer because science hasn't really taken up studying these practices, but I think that's an opportunity to think going forward, how can some of these practices be best adapted to non-traditional situations?
Right. And how do you build in that unison online in some meaningful way?
Yeah.
Very, very complicated. Someone in the chat said, the lag in Zoom really complicates that unison. And
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And I would say I do a lot of online service leading with our students in our religious school. And we said, sometimes we say when you're on mute, it's okay for you to sing too, right? Because then you sort of mimic that unison with the person leading, but it's not exactly the same. So I totally appreciate that challenge. Yeah, I'd love to hear some of your other findings from the variety of the stages and ages of life that you would love to share.
So, one problem is I call it the midlife crisis, but not the one you're thinking of probably. But if you look at happiness, the happiness curve in life, what you'll see is that it's kind of an inverted U. That is, people are happy when they're young. Happiness kind of, the nadir comes usually about late 40s, early 50s, and then it starts to go up. And you might say, well, that's self-reported happiness, right? Does that really mean anything? Well, if you look at the curve of antidepressive use, it's actually the opposite. It peaks at about the late 40s and mid 50s. So I think there's definitely something to it, and it's kind of universal. And what's normally happening in that time is it's a change in life. That is, you're still stuck in your career trying to figure out what to do, but it may not feel as rewarding anymore. If you have children, they're moving out. People who are the generation above you are passing. And what we find is that as people age, happiness comes back because they reorient their values. They reorient toward what truly brings happiness, which is social connection, service toward your family, your friends, or a larger cause, and those types of things, as opposed to kind of your career and trying to climb the status ladder. There's a place for that too in life, but it doesn't bring true happiness. And what we find, right, is that when people make that shift, they become happier, and it normally happens with age. But what you see during pandemics is it happens for everyone. So that difference between what younger adults and older adults value, kind of me, my career, getting ahead, versus social connection, spending time with people I love, service, etc. When the SARS pandemic hit, or now when COVID hits, suddenly the older folks and the younger folks look the same. There isn't that difference, because the younger folks are like, oh my gosh, suddenly the end of life to them seems closer too, because when you're 30, death seems really far away. But in a pandemic, it can seem closer. And so really what drives that isn't so much age, but it's your time horizon until when you think you might not be here anymore. As time becomes shorter, we turn toward the things that truly make us happy. But what's interesting is religions kind of try to remind us of that earlier. So, I was raised Catholic, and in Catholicism, we have Ash Wednesday, which is a reminder that you will return to dust and dust will come. In Judaism, right, you have the High Holy Days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, which is a period that kind of symbolizes the beginning and the end of life. But what's interesting is on both days, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you say the Unatana Tokef, part of which is who's going to die before their time in the coming year, who by sword, who by fire, who by flood, all of which we've seen, who by plague, which has happened a lot. unfortunately. And it's a reminder that right before that time of atonement, that you need to think about what's going on. And there's wonderful experiments from a lab in Stanford, California, where the psychologist studies aging, Laura Carson, and she asked people think about, if you were going to die in a couple of weeks, what would you want to do? How would you want to spend your time? And suddenly it makes them reorient things. They suddenly want to spend time with people they care about, make a mark of service to the world, and that brings true happiness. Those services, Ash Wednesday, Unatana Tokaf, before a period of reflection, do the same things. They're reminders to us in a ritualistic way, and they make us think about it because of all the symbolism that goes with it, of where we should be putting our efforts to bring happiness in this world. And if we make that shift sooner, we're not going to have that nadir in unhappiness that typically confronts people. And I think, I'm sure there are rabbis who say this too, but, Thomas à Kempis, who's a famous medieval Christian scholar, reminded people every day you should meditate on death. Don't promise yourself that you're going to be here tomorrow. Let that shape how you behave. In Buddhism, meditations on death are common. Sometimes they will even meditate in front of a decaying corpse to remind them that life is short. And I'm sure there are recommendations in the Talmud or in the rabbinic literature as well to do the same. But by ritualizing it, it makes it happen.
Absolutely. Definitely to, sort of act as though you're just a day before death, right? So that you're living in the world in those particular ways. I'm wondering, and I maybe want to share a few more of the rituals outside of Judaism, but one of the things that came up when I was listening to some of your talks was this idea of cultural appropriation of these rituals. And I'm wondering, maybe want to share a few more of the rituals that are outside of Judaism, and then sort of what we can, how do we feel about utilizing some of the learning that's coming from that?
Sure. So let me give you one more example, and then we'll talk about that. So, one of the other things the study we talked about initially was meditation. And there's this idea, if you talk to the lamas, what they'll tell you is, meditation, it'll help your memory. It'll reduce your stress, but that's not what it's for. It's to make you a more virtuous person, right? The Buddha said apocryphally, we don't know if he actually said it or not, I teach one thing and one thing only, which is the end of suffering. And there's the goal to reduce your own suffering, but also to reduce the suffering of all sentient beings. And this is what meditation is supposed to help. And so we ran some of the first studies looking at that. We brought people in who had never meditated before. We either put them on a wait list so they didn't meditate, or we had them meditate for 8 weeks at the foot of a Buddhist Lama. And after that, or you can't ask people, so would you be a nice person? Because what people are going to say, they're going to say yes, lying. Although I don't think most of them will lie. Most of them would say yes. But we all know when push comes to shove, we're not always as nice as we want to be, right? We've all that experience of walking past homeless people who need help, of not donating to help when people are when there's been a natural disaster in the world or whatever it might be. So how do we test this? Well, we brought them back to our lab and we told them, we're going to run some memory experiments on you. That wasn't true. The true experiment happened within the waiting room. When they entered the waiting room, there were 2 people already there who they thought were just other subjects who we were going to test. There were 3 chairs. The two people were sitting in the 2 chairs. So when you're the third person to come in, what do? You sit down in that 3rd chair. About 2 minutes later, so the 2 people sitting there already were actors. About 2 minutes later, we had an actor come in, and she was on crutches. She had one of those ankle boots, foot boots you wear on your feet when they're broken. And she was coming in. She didn't really have a broken foot, but she came in and she was kind of wincing in pain. And the people who were already there, we told them, just ignore her, thumb your phones, pretend you're not looking. It's kind of like when you're on the T in Boston, right? And somebody needs a seat, nobody looks at them. And so the question was, what would the people do? And what we found out is that by in the control condition where they hadn't meditated, right, about 16% of people got up to give their seat to this person. Among those who had meditated, 50% did, right? So we basically tripled the rate at which they were willing to see someone in pain, sacrifice their own comfort to come to this person's aid and see if they needed help. We've also done it with studies for revenge. To make a long story short, we have a crazy situation where you're working with somebody and they insult you and you have the opportunity to actually think you're going to cause them some some pain as retribution, mild pain. We don't let that happen, of course. And again, what we find is that when people insult you, some people want to exert a little bit of pain at them. But we, again, cut that rate by a third among people who have meditated. And so what you're seeing here is meditation actually increasing the virtue of compassion and kindness in people. We don't actually know the mechanism yet by which it does it, but we know that it does. And so we know the theological underpinnings for what this was supposed to do actually lead to changes in measurable behavior. So the question then is that Rabbi Amy brought up as well, what do we do about this? If you want to be compassionate, should you meditate? If you are suffering grief, do you want to incorporate elements of Shiva? And that brings up the whole idea of cultural appropriation. Now, you'll see we've done this as a society with meditation, right? You can meditate now without any of the theological Buddhist precepts that are attached to it if you don't want to. Same thing. The question is, can we do that with other rituals? I think we never want to take the prayers and symbols of a tradition. That would be cultural appropriation. You don't want Catholics saying Jewish prayers or vice versa, because it kind of doesn't respect the traditions. But if you look at the elements of these, right, there is commonalities to them in what people do, right? So, you can do lots of things in synchrony together. You can say the mourner's Kaddish, but you can sing a song. You can say another prayer. You can organize situations where you provide instrumental help and make sure somebody is always there. You can cover mirrors. It's not just in Shiva, right? Hindus do that. Irish wakes do that. And so I think what we can do is learn the nature of practices. You can meditate on death, not the prayers, not the theology, not the symbols, but the practices and how they affect the mind and body aren't owned by any one faith or another. And I think in that way, they can be utilized. Now the other big thing we're learning about is the benefits of psychedelics. Right? Psychedelics are a fast way to that transcendent spiritual experience. They can fight depression. They can fight anxiety. There are indigenous cultures in the Amazon who have used these forever. But what's interesting is about 20% of people who take psychedelics have a negative response to them. And about 8% of those people actually have such a frightening response that it'll actually lead them to seek psychiatric care. And even if you listen to Michael Pollan, who we had on the podcast, he'll tell you he had both types. He had a wonderful experience and he had a terrifying experience. But what we're finding in the psychological research is that if you have someone with you, if you have a guide with you who makes you feel comfortable, who's there to put a hand on you, to support you when you need that guidance, that makes all the difference in helping the situation go better. And afterward, we'll talk with you about it and help explain what happened with it to you. In the indigenous cultures, that's what the shaman does. But if you're just taking the psychedelics, if you're just taking ayahuasca or psilocybin at your local, Brooklyn hipster or Brookline hipster locale without any of the theological protections and guardrails attached to it, it can go badly. And so here the researchers at Johns Hopkins, they're not doing the shamanic prayers, but they're understanding the role and the comfort and the scaffolding that the shaman provided. And when they do that, they can get similar effects among people as well. And so I think if we have the hubris to think that we know how it's going to work and don't pay attention to the traditional knowledge that's gone with this, it's a problem. You see the same things in Native American sweat ceremonies now. People have died because the people who are doing it don't know how to regulate the temperature, don't know the signs to look for, et cetera. But when they work, they're helpful. The Veterans Administration at multiple VA hospitals are now building sweat lodges because they know it helps with PTSD. They don't understand how, but they have enough outcome data to know that it works.
Wow. Thank you for that. Actually, that brings up what in the chat, I got a question about the meditation that you're talking about, the work that you were doing, and whether that was independent of sort of a religious element, or did that include some sort of the scaffolding of religion?
So so we had a Buddhist Lama do it, but it didn't have the scaffolding. And we purposely just did straight mindfulness meditation because we didn't want to do loving kindness, because that felt like we're telling you to be loving and kind. Would that matter? And so, no, it didn't. But the question is, would it work better if it did? And we actually replicated that effect using an app, Headspace. We use Headspace because I know the guy who created it. He has monastic training, so he knows what he's doing. The question is, would it be an even more powerful effect if we had the theological parts attached to it? Typically when meditation happens in Buddhism, you would do it in a sangha, you would do it in a community. and there would be theological lessons that go with it. And so my friends who are lamas would say that they believe the benefit would be even larger. And so that's the other question for us as we go forward. Besides cultural appropriation, which I think we can get around, if we do kind of separate this from the theological beliefs, are the effects as large? We don't know the answer to that yet.
It's really interesting. I mean, obviously, I'm a rabbi. I believe in the power of community for a whole variety of reasons. But one of the things we're seeing a lot among sort of the next generation, so to speak, and even people of all generations, but really this sort of movement away from sort of traditional faith, sort of community, and some of the isms that you talked about before. And I guess I'm wondering, because when I was doing some research, that sort of sense of, I used my mind, the word scaffolding was what I was thinking about. And I'm wondering how you're seeing this change in people's affiliation with faith tradition impact your work.
It's potentially a problem. I mean, so people are leaving traditional. I mean, this last year, according to Gallup, was the first year that the majority of Americans didn't report being a member of a church, a synagogue, or a mosque or a temple. And there are good reasons why people can leave. I mean, the institutions are different than the faith, and there have been institutional abuses and scandals, and there are even gender discrimination. Certain faiths will not allow women and men to have equal roles, et cetera. And so, but most of them who are leaving, the majority are not becoming atheists, right? As Rabbi Amy said, they're trying to find new ways of spirituality. I think because they realize they're missing those tools and practices. But that raises two questions. One is the community connection. That is, if I decide that my spirituality is best defined by taking 30% of ideas from Judaism, 10% of ideas from Hinduism, add in a few Sikh rituals, and maybe, a Catholic saint, that could work for me, but it's going to be so finely tailored that it may not work for anybody else. And then we lose that sense of community. I mean, one way around it is what you'll see with Unitarian Universalists, right, who are a little more welcoming of different perspectives. But the question is, if we tailor things too finely, we can lose that community, and that's a problem, potentially. The other big issue is if we start creating our own rituals, how do they work? I mean, ritual design is a big thing in Silicon Valley now. There are firms for this. You want a ceremony for celebrating ringing the NASDAQ bell? We'll create you one. You want a ceremony for, something else, we'll create you one. But the problem is when you create ceremonies and rituals from whole cloth, you lose the benefit of those thousands of years of wisdom that have honed these to work by leveraging mechanisms of the mind and the body without maybe even understanding the science of how that works. And so I think rituals can be adapted and created, but I think what you have to do is look at and honor what came before and not just try and create something, because maybe it'll work, but the odds are that it's not going to work as well.
Wow, so interesting. And actually, one of the questions I had written down for myself earlier, and it came up actually in someone's direct message in the chat, sort of, but if we adopt these beneficial practices in a secular way, is there a role for religion other than bringing people to community? And my question was sort of a piece of that, which is that, in our community, we have people who affiliate with Temple AZ in a lot of different ways, some for the religious aspects, some for the cultural aspects. And I'm curious if you have any thinking about that, how that really plays out.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question, and I think it's individually tailored. What I can say is that a lot of people deeply feel this need or connection to be part of something beyond, right? That is beyond themselves. That is greater than humanity. And I think religion speaks to that spiritual need. That's a personal choice. Like I said, I can't, it relies on faith. A scientist can't tell you whether God exists or not. Even, rabbis and priests can't tell you. They'll say, I believe, this is what I believe. And it's really up to each individual person how they want to have that connection to something that they believe is greater. I think because that is in many ways a pan-human feeling, there will be that sense of spirituality and religion going forward. Can you adapt all of these rituals and use them in a secular way? Probably most of them. Will they work as well? We don't know the answer to that. And so I don't have a great answer, but I don't think religion is going away. I think institutionalized religion may change. I think the spiritual landscape is going to change. And I think we have to have an open conversation about the best ways to do that. And hopefully that will bring scientists and religious thinkers together, both of whom care, right, about human well-being. And so if we don't have that conversation, then I think we're doing everybody a disservice.
Absolutely. And I have just a couple more questions, and we do want to open it up to some questions from the community. I guess one of the things that I was thinking a lot about is I do a lot of work, a good portion of my work is with our youth. And I'm wondering how the work you're doing, the research you're doing, does it have a different connection if we were to think about it in children? You know, has there been any sort of a application of your work with young children?
So there hasn't been an application, but I can see ties, right? So I have to tell you, so I came to this because I studied meditation. I came to this because I studied the emotion gratitude and all the virtues it leads. And I studied that like motor synchrony stuff and how it brings connection. And what always happened to me was I would say, oh, look, I found a new way to make people feel connected or to, you know, be more virtuous. And I'd look around and I'd see religions have been using it for thousands of years. And so that's what led me to where I am. But I think, yeah, I mean, you know, I'm working on episode 2 for the next season of our podcast. So that will be out in late February, is going to be on, do children need religion to grow up to be good people? If you look at surveys, about half of Americans think they do. And that leads to a lot of conflicted parents who are leaving religion. You know, what do I do? And so if you look at the data, there are 2 ways that religion shapes virtue in children as they grow. One is that they believe God is watching them. And there's a lot of evidence showing that as kids come to awareness that God is omniscient and can watch them, that influences their honesty behavior. So kids who believe that God can watch them, there's lots of data showing that they behave better. Now, what we don't know is do they do that because they're worried? It's kind of like Elf on the Shelf, right? That I'm afraid of God and I'm going to be punished. Or do they do it because they love God and they believe that God values what they're doing and they want to do, just like if you believe your parent wants you to do this and they place emphasis on that, then if you know, all kids believe in their parents, they can see them, they want to do that. Well, if you believe in this all-loving being who thinks this is important, will you do it? We don't know which of those it is, but we also do know that cultivating certain things in children, like feelings of gratitude, right? I bring people into my lab. I make them feel grateful by counting their blessings. I give them the opportunities to cheat on something. The opportunities to cheat go down. The opportunities to be generous go up just by feeling that emotion. We know gratitude is tied to a lot of prayers, right? If you do the I'm probably going to say it wrong, but the Nasim B'Chol Yom, or there's a more formal name for that, right? The miracles of the everyday, or the Moda Ani in the morning, that is a prayer for gratitude. And throughout the day, if you say the 100 blessings that the rabbis recommend, that cultivates gratitude. And gratitude will make you a more virtuous, a more honest, and more generous person. When you read stories, right, about people who were noble, whether it's a civil rights leader or whether it's a holy person, that creates in you this emotion that's called elevation, which is this feeling of, you feel that your chest expand, like when you know, if you see Mother Teresa ministering to the poor, or you know, John Lewis when he was alive fighting for civil rights and marching, we know that emotion makes people want to be more virtuous, and we can show ties of that. And so with kids, when you read stories about noble events from the Torah or the Quran or whatever scriptures you're doing, and they have that emotion, it makes them feel better. You can do the same thing with civil rights leaders if you're a secular person or other noble people. And so I think what we're trying to do is look for ways that religion inspires these feelings of gratitude and elevation, or even awe. The awe, when you experience awe from nature, we know awe makes people more generous, more kind. You can have awe when you're in worship ceremonies. That's a more positive way of increasing virtue in kids than God is watching you. Don't feel guilty and mess up. But we're just trying to study those now.
Yeah, you made me think about Brene Brown and shame. So, we don't want our kids to feel shame at all.
Right. Shame can be a very powerful emotion at times. And in limited doses, it can be very useful and good and important. But as a long-term thing, in terms of a relationship to God or to anybody, it's terribly toxic, as she says. And that's why these other more positive emotions, I think, are more positive ways to get there. And religion, when done well, cultivates those states.
So I'm going to ask one more question and then open up for some conversation from our community. I'm going to go on a limb, sort of ask you this notion of these spiritual technologies. Certainly I have resonance for the ones in Judaism, but I'm curious just personally as a scientist and also someone who studies these, what are the spiritual technologies that you have really either personally experienced that are very meaningful to you, or that in your work just seem to really rise to the top that you'd want to share with our community?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a good question. I have made it now part of my daily routine to kind of have a gratitude practice. And, I would say I'm an agnostic person. That is, I'm not part of any religious tradition, though I certainly am willing to admit that I don't know if there's anything greater. There certainly may well be a higher power in the universe. And I try to find my own gratitude practice during the day that is to kind of cultivate that state regularly, because I see it in my own data, what it does for people. I wish I meditated more. I don't make enough time for it. I should, but it does have benefits. And, I think next time that I have to do something with, so, I'm Catholic by culture. We have the wake and then it's done. And I think what I really want to try and do is create, in a secular way, more of that experience of an ongoing period of several days where people come together and have that continuing celebration and reminisce and eulogize and provide support in the way Shiva does. Because from all the data that I see, all of those elements can have a profound effect. I also try to meditate on death. I mean, I'm getting older as it is. I'm in my 50s, so I'm at that period of the nadir. But when I do that, it does help me reorient myself, and I worry less about getting my next paper out, as a scientist, and more about, what kind of mark am I making in this world.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure.